Severus Snape walked along the teaching corridor, past his own classroom and stood adjacent to the Mole Studies classroom door. The fifth-year students who were lined up there exhaled with consternation as the tall wizard perused with undisguised disgust the students awaiting him. "I want to be here as much as you do," he intoned as a begrudging class stood one behind the other automatically. "What do I know about moles?" he added, looking at the sheet of paper he had been handed as the students filed past him and into the classroom. Things hadn't been going well. Since Dumbledore's departure the evening before, Dolores Umbridge had taken it upon herself to hold Hogwarts together for the sake of the Ministry and, of course, the students. For that's why we're here, of course. Having had headship dumped upon her, Snape had to admit she had taken it by both hands and was trying to hold it all together without too much uproar, but there had been problems. For a start, Umbridge just didn't have a clue how to run a school and was causing an inordinate amount of problems for everyone, himself included. It was something he'd probably anticipated when he put whichever part of his plan it was into action, but Snape's role was different now to what it had once been. No longer was he a confidant and servant of Voldemort, but whether this fitted into Dumbledore's preparations to defeat the Dark Lord, Snape did not know. Secondly, Umbridge had sent Tabitha Penright off on an errand somewhere away from the castle. Snape would not have ordinarily minded. Since his visit with Sturgis Podmore to the Department of Mysteries to convince her to join them, he had been undecided as to whether the Mysteria was simple and naive or whether she was at the other end of intelligent bordering on the crazy. Either option sounded plausible. Nevertheless, Professor Penright was not where she should be, and neither was he. Snape should be, by rights, free to enable him to plan for further lessons, including the Newt potions for the next year, not having to babysit a class full of fifth years on additional mandatory lessons that had been written by Umbridge herself for the students to follow from the end of their exams until the end of the school year. Shaking his head, Snape stepped into the Mole Studies classroom and closed the door behind him. It wasn't as if he didn't want to assist Penright, Snape thought, as he compelled the Mole Studies core texts to whiz across the room to each student sitting dolefully in front of him. Despite his efforts to avoid her, there had been occasions following his visit to the Ministry and his tour of the Department of Mysteries where he had shared rather more than he would have liked and had, more or less, collaborated with her. Sadly, she was not as good a colleague as Cecilia Frobisher. Turn to page 11. Chapter 3. Snape looked down at his hastily scribbled note in Tabitha Penright's handwriting before glowering at the class. "You are to continue to read the chapter to the end and then answer the following question." He turned over the paper. How far should you go to assist a mole in danger? He saw the class glance at one another furtively. "Well? You do know what I am talking about? This continues from the work Professor Penright did with you in yesterday's lesson, yes?" He looked around at the fifth-year students who seemed to be in various states of unconsciousness and frowned horribly. "Am I right?" he roared, making several of the class sit up sharply. "Yes, sir," chorused a few. "Well, get on with it then." Snape stalked towards the teacher's desk at the front and continued to contemplate the current situation. Cecilia Frobisher, he wished, could still talk to her. "Mole Studies," confirmed Hermione as she, Ron and Harry crept along the teaching corridor, late to their lesson. "So we've got Poodle Penright?" asked Ron as Harry leaned on the door of the classroom. They looked down the classroom and a sinking feeling descended on them, for it was not Tabitha Penright who they would have to explain their lateness. "Snape," whispered Ron in a not too subtle tone of voice. "And you are late because—" "Please, Professor," began Hermione, but Harry walked up to his potions teacher, who now turned out to be his Mole Studies teacher. "We were being interviewed by Umbridge, who seemed to think that we had something to do with Professor Dumbledore's disappearance yesterday." He held the stare that Snape was giving him, and eventually the wizard looked at Ron and Hermione, who nodded too. Around them mutterings began to ripple through the class. "Take your seats," continued Snape mockingly. "I'm sure whatever was so important for the new headmistress of the school to speak to you about. You may now turn your attention to your lesson." He paced over to a couple of desks where very little had been done by the students there, and pulling a parchment from an unresisting grasp, "Although I see the point of the lesson has been completed to nowhere near satisfaction." He surveyed the students' faces, who had all now raised their head and were paying him attention. "Mrs. Frobisher would be disappointed that her efforts to teach you had been completely wasted." And, as Harry, Ron and Hermione took their seats, Snape paced to the front of the Mole Studies classroom and began to teach. For a few moments many of the class looked on in amazement at the ability of their usual severe potions teacher, the head of Slytherin House, expressing empathy and understanding for moles in danger, and despite his none too subtle protests to the contrary, Harry listened in fascination as Severus Snape taught a Mole Studies lesson in the same way as Cecilia Frobisher had done only months before. The work became hands-on. Snape paired them up and got them to act out possible mole-endangering situations and allowed them to work through the possible solutions that were not illegal, immoral, or jeopardizing the dignity of the mole in the scenarios or themselves. All in all, a lesson that Harry would have considered to be unbelievable if he had not just witnessed it himself. At the end of the lesson, once a very dazed and somewhat confused class of students were dismissed, Harry remained behind. Snape seemed to be in no rush to leave, as he was scrutinizing something on the desk in front of him, and Harry approached him slowly. "You still here, Potter?" Harry nodded. "Why?" "Well, I was late to your lesson, sir," he gave as an explanation, and Snape's eyes narrowed mistrustfully. "You may go," Snape said finally. "If it were my lesson, however, I would be keeping you. Consider yourself lucky." He dropped his head and continued to read. After a time, presumably because he hadn't registered the door open and close, Snape looked back up. "Is Mrs. Frobisher really dead?" blurted out Harry clumsily. He felt embarrassment fleet across his features, and he realized Snape had noticed it too. "What concern is it of yours, Potter?" "I knew her, not very well of course, but she was a nice person." Harry glanced at the parchment that Snape was holding, and the wizard folded it sharply in half. "Nice?" He folded his arms and walked around to the other side of the desk, his features contorting at the horrific nature of the word. "How awful, nice," he repeated scornfully. "Flowers are nice, Potter. Slytherin beating Gryffindor at Quidditch is nice. And to answer your first question, the desolement of a mole leaves them quite definitely dead. Perhaps you wish to continue this conversation in more detail? Perhaps you would like me to describe what it would be like? What it would have felt like?" Harry stared back at Snape's tormenting face, clearly speaking to him like that in a deliberate attempt to upset him. He shook his head mutely. "There are some who were close to her who miss her dearly." Snape's tone had changed, and his voice was now low and threatening, making it clear that the conversation about Mrs. Frobisher was closed, and Harry's mind drifted back to a few weeks before and the glimpse of the intimate memory. Then, as he regained the sense of the then and there, he realized that Snape was pointing towards the classroom door. "Lupin," nodded Harry, and watched as Snape nodded slowly too. "Malfoy killed her. I mean, not actually killed her," he added when he saw Snape's face change from ashen to slightly pink. "But he informed the Ministry." Snape said nothing, and Harry exhaled inwardly. "Professor Snape," said Harry clearly and calmly as he tried again. "My aunt. How is my aunt involved in all of this?" "And how do you know that she is?" asked Snape, withdrawing his arm and folding one over the other. "The Daily Prophet said that she was found in Little Whinging. So it has to be something to do with Aunt Petunia." Snape's lips narrowed to almost nothing, and he looked away from Harry's shrewd expression. And then he asked him a question which Harry would definitely not have answered had Snape not gestured for him to sit down, and he had not sat down on a student chair too. "I take no pleasure in knowing this, Potter, but it may help answer some questions that we all have. Harry nodded and proceeded to detail some of the less painful examples of Petunia Dursley's treatment of him for the 10 or so years he had been in her care. What precisely was her reaction when she knew you were a wizard? Harry opened his mouth to speak, and then closed it quickly. Horrified, he said plainly. Why do you think that was so? Pressed Snape, his tone having changed to one of compassion which Harry to have believed the austere wizard was far from capable. Well, I always got the feeling that if I hadn't been a wizard then she would have liked me better. So, it was the fact you are a wizard, not the fact you are you. Yes, I suppose so, but dash. And how did she react to the mention of spells and magic in the house? Hated it, but dash. Thank you, said Snape, his tone one of finality as he got to his feet. Your information has been most useful. Professor Snape, asked Harry, determined now to ask the question he had been daring himself to ask since the end of the ball the day before. I know what a Horcrux is. When Professor Dumbledore left he said Voldemort only had one more to find. Harry's voice trailed off as Snape stared silently back at him. Do you know where it is? There was a long pause and then Snape shook his head. No, he repeated. Now, if you would be kind enough to leave. He waited until Harry had taken the hint that the conversation was over, and as he put his hand on the doorknob Snape began to speak again, his voice returning to the derisive, scaling tone that Harry had come to know and loathe. If you are ever late for one of my lessons again, Potter, whatever your excuse, I want you to be clear that you will be in for 2 hours detention. 88,888,888. He will be here, said the traitor as he and the Death Eater entered the underground car park in Chelsea. He is greedy and he wants the money. He'd better be, or I will not stand in the way of the Dark Lord's wrath. He repays disloyalty most generously with pain. The traitor said nothing. He was able to see the expression on the Death Eater's face even if the wizard himself believed it to be conveyed secretly to the darkness. They wove their way down a few more flights of stairs to the basement level of the car park where a few flickering lights beheld the lone car parked to one side. Let me, said the traitor, putting his palm flat towards the Death Eater. If he suspects trouble then he might not give us what we want. What exactly is he going to be telling us? Asked the Death Eater mistrustfully. We know already the location of the Dark Lord's Horcrux and you know the only person who can fetch it for us. He knows her better than us, replied the traitor, as the lights of the car flicked on, indicating to the practitioners of magic that the mole in question was aware of their presence. His information is valuable and it will become loosened with a large amount of lucrative lubrication. They approached the car slowly and the traitor slipped from sight momentarily as the Death Eater knocked on the window, put out a little at his colleague's confusing alliteration. I've got the information you need, began the mole, getting out of the car. We can talk here, there's no problem. The car park's locked from the outside. The Death Eater bore down on the man, whose initial expression of confidence was replaced by uncertainty. I dealt with someone else before, the man added as the Death Eater's face contorted into a mask of horror. Is he here with you? As if on cue the traitor reappeared. He was impressed. It usually took people a good few minutes to adjust to his presence, but the mole simply took it in his stride. Of course, the traitor replied, stepping in front of the Death Eater and shaking the mole man's hand a few times. You have done well so far. My colleague here, the traitor looked at the Death Eater, wishes to confirm the tasks you have already carried out and bear witness to the last one before you are paid. At the word paid a ripple of anticipation crossed the man's features and the traitor smiled inwardly. And now we have reached the bottom of this man's well. He would do anything for money. So? Asked the Death Eater impatiently, looking between the man and the traitor. What do you have for us? And so the mole revealed in glorious sketchiness information he had prized from another the day before, much to the satisfaction of both the Death Eater and the traitor. So you are saying that the information she has uncovered leads to a supposed link between wizards and moles? The man nodded. It would appear so. From what she said, nodded the man. The Death Eater took a pace towards the mole, but the traitor stood in front of him. So you could have discovered that information, concluded the Death Eater, hissing his accusation at the traitor. Continue, mole. The traitor noticed a flicker of recognition at the word pass over the man's face, and he added, waving away the abruptness of the Death Eater, please continue. But the man did not immediately, and instead looked back at the Death Eater. Where's the money? Here, replied the traitor quickly. I promised you, didn't I? He watched as the mole man stared at the Death Eater and take a step backwards. You promised me. I've been dealing with you since the phone call, he added, his voice tinged with fear, and he waited for recognition to register on the traitor's face. The traitor nodded. So I will talk to just you alone? I have the details. The man looked at the traitor and then at the Death Eater. Peter Pettigrew said nothing, and the traitor took it as a signal that he could take the man aside, and he did so, guiding the mole round to the other side of his car. Once he had shared every piece of information that his sister had shared with him, the traitor led him back round to Wormtail. He is prepared to answer any questions you like, said the traitor, his voice light and nonchalant. The mole nodded in agreement. Tell me, began Wormtail, about the task in Scotland. At his words the mole's face contorted into horror. I did it, he stammered, trying to force pride out with fear. I killed those women. But not the child. Wormtail began to pace round to the other side of the mole, and the man was in the unfortunate position of having one on each side of him. There was a child? Even if I had realized, I would not have killed a child. Wormtail snorted in disagreement. Not quite anything for money, thought the traitor, intrigued. You said 35, said the man, changing the subject, and he addressed the traitor, who was standing on his right. What? 35 thou? Oh, but of course, replied Wormtail, his voice light and airy, which should have made the man cautious rather than relaxed. We have the information we need. On all counts. And the science, added the traitor. Wormtail raised one thick eyebrow. Well, just basic, added the man. You could get it from anyone. Why doesn't he? The man's inner mind questioned silently. And your sister? Asked Wormtail, inching his way closer to the man. Oh, her? She's no one important. She knows this stuff, but it's all irrelevant, I'm afraid. Well, that's where you're wrong, said Wormtail lightly. Tell me the last thing she said to you. She is teaching and not enjoying what she's doing. And what specifically does she do? Well, she had a book in her hands that she was reading when she was asking me about science. And about her new work, he added. Come on, his subconscious thought, hoping that the arrow of caution would penetrate to his conscious mind. That's enough. You should be going about now. About the artifact she is investigating. Mysterious mythology. Thank you, exclaimed Wormtail, his face twisting into what the man could only hope was a smile. But the thought of caution that his subconscious so wanted him to hear arrived too late. As the wizard raised his wand, Robert Penright realized Avada Kedavra. That he should never have got into this in the first place. 88,888,888. Hermione bent her head over the letter she had just received. It was unusual for owls to deliver letters so late in the evening, yet when they came from the ministry they could arrive at any time. Trying to make it make sense, she read the words through for a fourth time. We wish to inform you that your parents. Under new ministerial powers. Unable to ascertain magical intent. Hereby befuddled before the end of the day of 20th June. Due to a backlog in befuddlements, we apologize for not being able to give a more specific time. Security measures. Hermione shook her head and felt her eyes fill with tears. Even if she left now, she wouldn't be able to save them. She would go home and they would hardly recognize her, if at all. If only she had decided to go home instead of returning after the Easter holidays. Mrs. Frobisher was dead. Dumbledore was gone. Her friendships were hanging together by a thread. And now this. You are. Behind her, coming up the stairs of the Gryffindor Tower, was Ron. His voice was a mixture of relief and uncertainty. This is where you've been hiding. Hermione turned to snap back at her boyfriend, to tell him he had no right to follow her and what was he doing here, but instead the words became choked at the back of her throat and the intended flood of words was replaced by lachrymosity. Ron said nothing but hurried towards her and took her in his arms, stroking her back, and the torrent of tears soaked into his shirt. When Hermione's sobs turned to sniffs, he leaned her back into a sitting position and stroked a hand down her sleeve. Hermione followed it with her red, sore eyes and smiled a little when he took her hand in his. "Come on," he said, getting to his feet and helping Hermione to hers. "Whatever it is, you need to be with your friends." Hermione shook her head and remained where she was, clutching the letter from the Ministry in the other. Ron looked at it and she thrust it in front of him, opening her hand to reveal the parchment with its distinctive blue ribbon. "I'll read it," nodded Ron. "But you're going to come down after then?" Saying nothing, Hermione nodded and she watched her boyfriend take the parchment from her. She watched his face contort as he too read the horrifying details. When he had finished, he handed her back the letter. "They'll still remember you," he said, taking her hand again as Hermione got to her feet, and the young witch said nothing. This was precisely why she had chosen to come to the top of the Gryffindor Tower in the first place. She knew she couldn't make Ron understand the extent of the devastation she was feeling. Once they were down the steps, Ron took her into the common room. Few people were there and he led her over to the sofa where Harry and Ginny were sitting. They turned when they saw the pair approaching, and on seeing Hermione's distress, Ginny leapt up and pushed her way between them before peeling Hermione off to another part of the common room, telling her that it wasn't just her parents but all the Mulborns. Ron watched them go before flopping onto the sofa next to his friend. Even today, with summer in full-fledged, the crackling of the open fire was comforting. "You found her then?" Harry looked at his friend, who nodded. "Top of the tower. She's got her letter then?" Ron nodded again and leaned towards Harry. "It's not just the Mulborns," he said, pointing to an article tucked underneath the main one which was declaring open criticism of the Ministry's security measures. "The rumors are true. I went outside the Edgestones and flew Dad." "Yeah, I know it was risky," Ron added when he saw Harry's expression. "I would have made something convincing up, but it was Shacklebolt on the door and I told him I'd been to see to Fang. Anyway," he continued, shaking the paper and pointing to the article again, "Dad said they're hated more than moles and there's a backlog that the Ministry's got to process. Hagrid's been called away but they're dealing with the ones they think are the most dangerous. Dad told me that they'd sent letters to Hogwarts." Harry thought about that evening when, at dinner, a deluge of owls brought every Mulborn witch and wizard the same notice. But what good's it going to do by imprisoning all the half-breeds? All they're doing is trying to show they're doing something. "Exactly," nodded Ron. "But Dad said the official line was that they're being imprisoned for their own safety. Lupin's to be taken, Tonks has been followed too. My husband, Mrs. Frobisher's friend." Harry's eyes widened as he took it in. Then he got to his feet. "Where are you going?" asked Ron, standing up too. "There's something I've got to do." "Something secret, I suppose," complained Ron, and Harry felt sorry for him. "You can come with me," he conceded. "If you think Hermione's going to be all right on her own." They both looked over at the other settee. Hermione was sitting there, head in her hands with Ginny nowhere to be seen. "I'll stay with her," said Ron, and both boys crossed the common room floor, Ron sitting next to Hermione and taking her hand, Harry heading for the door and the fat lady. On the corridor things were worse than in the common room. Alcoves, stairs and doorways all housed clusters of people sobbing, comforting and consoling. The only house whose members did not seem to be engaging in such activities, Harry noticed as he hurried along the corridor and down the main staircase, was Slytherin. Indeed, there seemed to be a notable lack of representation from them. As he crossed into the large hallway towards the main castle doors, Draco Malfoy pushed past him. Harry looked over his shoulder and saw behind him what looked like a small gang of fifth years in pursuit. He turned back and watched as Malfoy marched through the courtyard heading, it seemed, towards the classrooms. Harry wasn't surprised. The rumor that Draco had been somehow involved in Mrs. Frobisher's death had got out and had spread like wildfire around Hogwarts. If that hadn't been enough, Dumbledore leaving and the arrival of the Mulborns' letters that evening would probably have angered more than enough of his fellow students. And then Harry stopped. Malfoy had been cornered by a few students just before the main classroom corridor. The students, all representing the other three houses, were tormenting him, but even as they insulted him he wasn't biting back. "Oi!" Harry found himself shouting as he turned and hurried over to the crowd. One or two faces looked in his direction, but most of the small throng remained fixed on Malfoy. "Leave him alone," Harry said firmly, pushing between them, and most of the students turned to look at him, including Draco, and Harry was shocked to see that his usually fresh-faced if pale appearance had given way to ashen skin and sunken eyes. "What business is it of yours, Potter?" Justin Finch Fletchley narrowed his eyes. "I'd have thought you'd have thanked us for doing you a favor. After all, he killed the Mole Studies teacher, a mole." One or two of the other students nodded in agreement, and one girl from Hufflepuff waved her letter. "He's not to blame for the ministry," replied Harry sharply. "Leave him alone." Before the group could do anything though, Draco turned towards Harry and scowled, before pushing past them and trudging, head bent, down the teaching corridor. "I can't believe you just did that!" exclaimed Terry Boot. "After all the jip he's given you since you got here, Harry." But Harry just turned and headed towards the east gateway towards the owlery, leaving behind the cries of disbelief that his actions had encouraged. Once there he sat amongst the now roosting owls on the central wall and held his head in his hand and began to mull things over. If it were true, if what the prophecy was holding meant Voldemort could return to his full self or die, if he went and faced the Dark Wizard. Harry badly wanted to talk to Sirius. Since knowing that Sirius Black was his godfather, he had felt more comfortable with the unknown because he had someone who was concerned about him, a little like parents would be, Harry imagined. But Sirius had made it clear that he had to decide when was he going to learn not to rely on him anymore. Every part of him wanted to find a vacant fireplace and risk it, or beg Ron to show him how to make a portable flue, but there was a part of him that agreed with Sirius. He had to make his own mind up now, especially considering what Dumbledore had told him about the prophecy all those weeks before. "Harry." Hermione's voice rang through the nearly still air, ruffling the feathers of some of the owls roosting by the door hooted at her in annoyance as she and Ron walked over to him. "How are you?" asked Harry as they sat down next to him. "How are you more like," said Ron, looking round the owlery. "You'd prefer to tell your woes to a bunch of feather brains?" Harry jerked his head sharply towards his best friend as Hermione touched his arm. "You're freezing," she said, rubbing his arm. "It's going to get pretty cold in here soon. Why don't you come back to the common room?" "No thanks," said Harry, getting to his feet and shrugging off Hermione. "I can make his own decisions." "Hermione can help you," said Ron as he saw Hermione's face begin to crinkle in distress. "All this. It's not a competition. She knows some science that can help you, and some other things which might be useful. Even though Mrs. Frobisher's dead and she is likely to have been the one to have caused it." Harry stared at Hermione, but instead of crying as he'd expected, she sprang to her feet too. "How dare you throw that back into my face?" she yelled, her face turning lobster pink. "After what you did to her? And there I was trying to help you after you'd chickened out yet again." Hermione folded her arms defiantly as Harry made to reply. Instead he sighed. His efforts had come to naught. His pursuance of the men of science in Lupin's book. The spell. The potion. Harry was beginning to realize that he couldn't do it alone. And I was leaving last night. I was going home to Mom and Dad with the information I had to fight it from the outside. My world out there, my mole world is changing. Crumbling. And now my parents are to be befuddled and Dumbledore's gone. I was going to tell him everything I knew. Both Ron and Harry stared at her in alarm. She'd never talked about leaving before. Clearly there were things she hadn't shared with either of them. And the truth was, Harry did need her help. The truth is. I'm scared. Harry threw down his fists by his sides and allowed his head to droop. Mrs. Frobisher said. He turned to look through the owlery window. "Harry. Talk to us." "What did she say?" Hermione and Ron were standing either side of their friend and speaking to him softly. He looked at them and they were shocked to see his expression. "When the potion is completed, it will afford you protection. Once it is used, you will be ever free of Voldemort, from your waking mind as much as your dreams." He looked between his two friends. "That's what Mrs. Frobisher told me. I want that. I need that. The emotional state of a wizard had a bearing on how well the spell works. I must use Avada Kedavra on Voldemort with two opposing emotions in my mind. For at that moment all my other magical abilities will be reduced right down and add more power to the killing curse. And suddenly Harry hung his head and supported it in his hands. He wasn't crying, but internal conflict was evident. Ron and Hermione exchanged glances as they patted his back comfortingly. "Hermione's been working on something too," said Ron when Harry finally straightened up. "Mrs. Frobisher asked her about Horcruxes and she's done some research." "Would you like to hear about it?" asked Hermione, and she felt her heart soar when Harry nodded in agreement. They sat back on the owlery's central wall and the young witch began to talk to her friend as Ron. "I've looked into all of this and it all fits. And I've verified it. And it fits in with what you've just said." She smiled at Harry, her eyes glimmering. "Don't ask me where I got this from, but let's just say you and Ron aren't the only ones who go out of the dorms at night and Umbridge hasn't a clue about security." Harry rolled his eyes towards Ron as much as to ask his friend whether he knew about this, and Ron shook his head. "Go on, then," said Harry as the easy familiarity of being with his friend slotted back into his psyche. "You know what a Horcrux is, yes?" asked Hermione. Both Ron and Harry nodded. "Right," she nodded. "So, there's only person who's been taken into custody from Azkaban without dying in there, and that was Regulus Black, Sirius's brother. He was arrested after the end of the First War and sent to Azkaban, while the Black summoned up enough energy to cast a spell to reduce his power. No one could understand it. After all, Death Eaters want more power, not less, but they ignored it. As it happens, you know who did the same thing at the same time, but for him the spell caused a rent in his soul and caused it to split up. The only place for a piece of a soul to be put, when cast under a Horcrux spell, is inside another object who has also had the spell performed or has performed it themselves. He wanted to keep it safe until he knew what he could do to sort it out." Hermione stopped and let the information float around the owlery as Ron and Harry digested it. "You don't mean to say," said Ron, who hadn't understood it when Hermione had told him before. "So you're saying that Regulus Black has a part of Voldemort's soul inside him?" Hermione nodded, but Harry shook his head. "He's dead. He can't have. If a person's dead, or the object destroyed, then the soul returns to the person. And Dumbledore definitely said that there was a Horcrux out there." "If it's a part of Voldemort," said Ron. "It has to be," replied Hermione. He needs all parts of it to regain his full power. That's what stopped him in February. He must have thought very highly of him to trust him with that, said Harry vaguely. Hermione shook her head. No. He thought Regulus would either be restored to him as a Death Eater if he could organize a mass breakout through Draco's father, or he would die, in which case it would be restored to him later. I don't know, it doesn't all make sense, but I'm sure if we were to work on it together. Hermione looked down. I'm sorry for not listening to you. Harry reached over and put his hand over hers, which was folded tightly over the brick of the wall, and she smiled. So am I sorry for bringing up about, well, you know. Harry exhaled. Some of it made sense. He knew he must carry out the potion in the Department of Mysteries. Dumbledore had told him so. He had also told Harry he could inadvertently make Voldemort stronger. Ron and Hermione stared at him when he shared that with him. Why have you been up here on your own, mate? Asked Ron eventually. If they were sharing their inner fears, then it was clear he didn't want to be left out. I thought it was a girl, or something. I thought you were going strange. And now you're telling me you're trying to figure out the potion you need to take on your own? I have no choice, replied Harry quietly. It would have worked the last time if Mrs. Frobisher hadn't intervened. I have to believe it would work now, with their alterations. And you have to say the words with as much hatred for Voldemort but with an equal amount of love for your parents, interjected Hermione, rubbing his arm. Harry nodded. Sirius told me to work it out for myself, and he's right, Harry said, looking between his friends. I don't know what he told you. He looked at Hermione, who blinked in alarm, but I think he thinks he's going to make things worse. This is as far as I've got. He handed a piece of parchment to the young witch. Last time you helped her, Hermione. This time, will you help me? Hermione took the parchment, unrolled it and read the information thereon. Eventually she looked up. You did this on your own? Harry nodded. Snape didn't help you? This time he shook his head. But what if? I tried to talk to Snape yesterday about the potion and again today about something simple, conceded Harry, raising his eyebrows in Ron's direction. He wouldn't listen to me. He wouldn't because he's Snape, muttered Ron darkly. He didn't even give you a chance? He dismissed you out of hand? Harry shook his head. No. He listened to me. He told me he was impressed with my understanding of the situation. Snape told you he was impressed with something you'd done? Asked Ron doubtfully. Harry nodded. Yesterday. He told me to forget about it. He told me I was the boy who lived, not the boy who lived to die. And then today he wouldn't even engage me in conversation. I suppose that's what Dumbledore's disappearance does for you. Who knows, said Hermione, her voice sounding brighter than it had done for a long time. The Order has clearly got their own agenda which we can't possibly begin to guess at. We've got to work this out for ourselves. For you, she added. Harry smiled. So we need to share everything we know so we can work out where to go next, continued Hermione forthrightly. Ron, you said that Harry knew something about Snape and a memory that Harry saw? Harry jerked his neck so he was looking at his best friend. Well? Hermione looked between the two young wizards much as a teacher might at two truth economic children. You don't want to know, moaned Harry. If we are to sort this out, then I need to know. So I'm asking you. And then Hermione wished she hadn't. You saw what? I told you you didn't want to know, sighed Harry. I don't know what it means. It means, said Hermione, her tone sounding as if she was fighting patronization. Ginny was right after all. Snape loved Mrs. Frobisher. And then she got to her feet and shook her head. Only what? Asked Ron as Hermione began to pace around silently. Only, that means the letter must be wrong. But it can't be. She looked at both Harry and Ron, forgetting completely that they didn't know what she was talking about. "Look. Here." Hermione pulled a piece of parchment out of her jeans pocket. "I was going to tell you, Harry. Tell you both. But I was going last night. And then I didn't." "Snape and my mother?" "It would certainly seem like they were close," said Ron, who had been reading the letter over his shoulder. "He seemed to be helping her because of Lupin." "She's asking if he can help her help Lupin," said Hermione. "From the date they're in their 7th year. She was going out with your dad then?" Ron nodded too, and Harry's shoulders relaxed a little. Then he stared at Hermione. "And how did you find out about this?" Harry demanded. "It was an accident," admitted Hermione, feeling a blush build upon her chest that was sure to flow up and engulf her entire face. "I found out about the Continuum of Wizards in Dash." "The Continuum of Wizards?" interrupted Ron. "What's that?" asked Harry. "It's a theory Mrs. Frobisher came up with," said Hermione, her face lighted up and her voice rich with excitement. "She said that wizards and moles can't be categorized. She said she had evidence to show that there is a range of magical ability. That there are some people out there who have a little bit of magical ability whose parents passed this on to them, or they have a limitation in their ability to learn magic." "What? Like Neville?" "What?" asked Hermione and Harry together. "Like Neville?" asked Ron again. "He's like that, isn't he? He has trouble with magic, but he's not a squib." Hermione nodded. "And Mrs. Frobisher came up with this?" Harry shook his head in astonishment. "I really wish she was here now," he lamented. "Don't we all?" said Hermione, walking towards him lightly and touched him on the arm. Ron, on the other side of Harry, touched hers in turn, and Harry patted Ron on the back. They were themselves again. Whatever falling out they had had, it wasn't going to affect their friendship from now on. "Right. We know about Regulus Black, and Snape's memory, and the letter, and the Continuum. Is there anything else we need to know?" Hermione looked at Ron and Harry, waiting for them to answer. "Come on," she chided. "Anything at all might help, and then we can plan what to do." She saw Harry exhale. Whatever he was about to tell her was going to be tender. "There's the stuff that Sirius told me about in February about his brother and about Henrietta Edwards. He didn't want to tell me everything, but..." Harry clenched his fists. "I can't think like this, Hermione." He looked at his friend. "You are collecting the information, but people have given their lives for this. For me, I'm not going to allow decisions about my welfare influence my judgment." And then, just as both Ron and Hermione suspected he was about to fly into a rage again, Harry smiled at his friends before telling them about it. "And Sirius's information about his brother and Henrietta Edwards," said Hermione, tacking this extra dimension to their already lengthy list. "That's enough to be getting on with. Now, what I suggest we start with is Dash." "A trace was put on Cecilia when she left Lupin's cottage," blurted out Ron, and interrupting Hermione again. "Well, you did say you wanted any information," he said, granting his friends the privilege of being taken aback. "Dad told me today. When he told me about the mole action by the Ministry. It came to light 2 days ago when they received the report about Mrs. Frobisher." Ron broke off and swallowed, his smile fading from his lips. "They put a trace on her before she got to the cottage. It wouldn't have mattered how many letters you sent, Hermione. It was only a matter of time before they found her." "Umbridge," declared Hermione angrily. "She told me. She made me believe. It was my fault. And she knew about this, then." She looked at Harry and Ron defiantly. "Well, I don't feel guilty about breaking into Dumbledore's office now. You know it's pink and she's got pictures of fluffy kittens everywhere." "Umbridge set the trace," confirmed Ron, and Hermione hurried over to him and he took her hand. "So it was Umbridge." Harry shook his head slowly as the whole picture began to slot into place. Malfoy found her, but it was the Ministry that killed her. Umbridge killed her. He trailed off to silence and Hermione took him by the shoulders. "We are with you, Ron and me." She patted her jeans pocket knowingly. "Like you say, I've got the information. Can you cope with that?" Harry nodded. Ron and Hermione smiled at one another. "Then whatever you want, Harry, whatever you decide, we're with you." 88,888,888. However, had he thought that Grimmauld Place would be a safe place to hide? He was so annoyed with himself to have attacked of Snape. Not that there was much love lost between them, but he let his emotions get away with him. It was here it had started, when he knew Snape, the secret keeper, wouldn't tell him where Cecilia was. He wouldn't let anyone help him either, not Sirius or Tonks or Dumbledore, after that. He had gone back to cottage and languished in self-pity until he had been taken back to the Ministry and then, through a series of unfortunate occurrences turned into werewolf, was arrested and recaptured. The waning moon glittered on the water that stretched before him. Usually it would mean to him that the worst was over. Tonight, however, as he watched the water ripple under the borrowed light, their inescapable destination meant the worst was yet to come. Their guard from the Ministry seemed to have things on her mind too. Hers, though, revolved around her boss's incompetence rather than her own for once, and Tabitha Penright seemed to have obtained the mucky end of the deal yet again. Not content with sending her from the castle, which Tabitha was grateful for, Umbridge had reassigned her to the task of re-interviewing the half-breeds that she had initially interviewed when she had been sent from Hogwarts the last time. At least she had had the fortune to leave the school before she was called upon to deal with the chaos that had begun upon the disappearance of Dumbledore, though. To say that Dolores Umbridge had problems was an understatement. In fact, even chaos was a mild word to the uproar that Tabitha had left behind her, a real rebellion in which her boss was unable to contain even the simplest of things with no cooperation of the staff nor pupils. There had been problems with the school's ghosts and poltergeist. She ordered the house elves, always a little highly strung at the best of times, to carry out Hagrid's duties. The gamekeeper had also mysteriously left on the evening of the ball, and had driven several dozen of them into hysterics when they encountered Fang. She had insisted that the Aurors return to the Ministry and then instantly regretted it when she came across a few mischievous children. The list was growing, so much so that Tabitha had had to ignore a flu message in the hearth in her office just so that she could do what her boss had ordered her to do. Under different circumstances Tabitha might sympathize with her. Dolores had Umbridge not assigned her to escort the half-breeds who had become dangerous and, as a result, had purchased a one-way ticket to Azkaban prison. Now, standing in the rain under a new assignment with Gregor, her elderly colleague from the Department of Mysteries, and Wylswick, a junior arithmancer, more used to columns of runes and sigils than people, and with the Ministry working overtime on the mull befuddling that was taking place over the next few days, Tabitha had just about run out of empathy. She looked past the caged prisoners, stacked too high on the open vessel, and her mind turned to relatively more comforting thoughts. It was strange how the befuddlement of the mulls had been passed by the Minister for Magic. Cornelius Fudge had always been reticent about the non-magic population of the country, taking an uncharacteristically liberal line. Now, Tabitha supposed, with Dumbledore gone and rumors of these animals being the media through which you-know-who was going to act had caused Fudge to act. All mulls who knew about the wizard world were being befuddled, those who were married to wizards, anyone who knew about the wizard world, her family and friends. Her family and friends. Robert, Serena, her mother Dash. Gregor had his wand raised and he motioned to Tabitha to stand by him. One of the prisoners was becoming restless. Though now in human form, the werewolf still appeared frightening. "They think they've caught all of them now," growled Gregor, his voice low and full of warning. "They're tricky devils, cowardly. Hiding for their lives." Tabitha nodded. That was the Ministry line. So far she had no reason to doubt it. But she could understand why they were becoming uneasy. She could feel the chill of dread pass through her as they approached Azkaban. Wiggleswick, who had been throwing up over the side of the boat, came to join them, and all three ministerial guards stood prone until the ship was tethered by its painter to the prison's wharf. Okay, get them in. Tabitha looked at the half-breeds who were now clamoring at the bars of their cages. Penwright, of the Department of Mysteries, she said to the chief officer at the wharf as other wizards began to open the cages, standing assertively with their wands outstretched. 15 here, she continued as she handed the wizard the parchment. All turned nasty under interrogation. 4 wizards dead, 3 seriously injured. The wizard unfurled the parchment and glanced down the list as the Azkaban warders began to direct the half-breeds at one point along a long dark corridor. Remus Lupin watched as the cages in front of him were unloaded, and his heart began to fill with dread. He should never have given in to his pre-lunar tension. Claiming to be going to find Cecilia's family was the stupidest thing he'd done, and then trying to get past the interrogator. Even if she was there, it would have put her in danger. But that's why they called it lunacy. He wanted her. That visceral urge. Wanting her. Needing her. Name? Remus Lupin. The Azkaban warden continued to point his wand at Remus's cage as another fired a couple of sparks at the lock. He flinched and watched the expression of mirth appear on the second guard's face. They had explained to all of them before they departed from the Middlesbrough Transporter Bridge, the secret dock in the north of England whence the boats bound for Azkaban departed, that any hint of escape and the warders would have no hesitation but to use the Avada Kedavra curse. There was to be no trial, the female guard had said before they left, and they would remain at Azkaban for their own safety. Remus had looked around at the other prisoners incarcerated like he was. They were just ordinary people, just like him. Crime? He had been convicted of attacking his interrogator, who had been foolish enough to continue the interview process at the exact moment that the full moon was about to rise. The poor man had lost an arm and most of his shoulder when Remus had gone for him. There was no excuse. He was guilty. Assault on Honora. But at least Cecilia was safe, wherever she was. That was what he had to cling to, even if the prospect of seeing her seemed further away than ever. He jumped down from his cage, which was stacked upon another now empty one. "Why are we being taken away?" Remus heard another werewolf say. The wizard had been in the cage adjacent to him, and he had been one who had killed his interrogator on the night that Remus had maimed his. "You are the enemies of Wizard World," laughed the wizard's warder. "We are no danger to people, with the right potion," said Remus as he followed the other werewolf, who nodded in agreement. "No, you misunderstand the purpose of your imprisonment here. Mr. Lupin, is it?" The warder who had undertaken the guard of the other werewolf turned his mustachioed face towards him. "Your imprisonment is for your own protection. This way it will stop moles getting suspicious," said his own guard. "And there's no point struggling, the Ministry would only make it worse for you. We've done nothing wrong." The werewolf in front of Remus screamed the sentiment of all of the prisoners on their boat, and others screamed and yelled in agreement. As they reached the transition point between outside and in, Remus felt inside his pocket and his hand closed round his last piece of chocolate. It wouldn't last long. He could hear the noises and sounds, like tortuous whispers coming from inside. As the warders changed places with the guards, he slipped the chocolate square into the hand of the werewolf in front of him, and the man half smiled at him in gratitude. "Keep them here, while we prepare the boat for the return journey." The chief officer relieved the guards of their duty and led them back out onto the wharf. The warders took a few steps away from their prisoners and formed a kind of elongated oval, so each of the prisoners was covered by at least 2 of them. Remus looked back out to sea. It was strange, surreal. Being here in Azkaban for a crime he had committed under impossible circumstances. No doubt being made to take the blame somewhere for mole protection or Voldemort or both. His mind drifted to a story in his storybook from which his father used to read to him as the moon continued to reflect onto the North Sea. It was the one he had got Harry to tear it out because it made a passing reference to Cleus Lupin, a sentimental error which his father had made, adding his son's name to the story and being unable to remove it.